much for coming. My name is Chen Tamir. So tonight's event is part of the Case in Point series that's co-produced by Artis and the Center for Contemporary Art. I am really, really excited for tonight's lineup. The plan is basically to hear from each of our three speakers consecutively, and then we're going to open the floor up to questions and discussions. But first up, I would just like to welcome Tali Sharizli from Artis.
So my name is Tali Sharizli, and I am the director of Artis in Tel Aviv. For those of you who don't know, Artis is an American independent 501c3 nonprofit organization that is dedicated to broadening awareness and understanding of contemporary art from Israel. This year is a very special year for us. It's our 10th year anniversary. And basically for the past 10 years, we've been working through public programs, a grant program that supports exhibition around the world, featuring artists from Israel, career development programs for artists, also our website that is meant to serve as a resource, and also I think one of the highlight of our programs is our curatorial research trips to Israel. Since 2007, we have brought to Israel over 100 arts professionals, curators, museum directors, art critics, and also right now we are happy to be hosting our 13th curatorial research trip to Israel, and we have 8 wonderful participants, and we are excited that 3 of them will be participating at tonight's event. We started the Case in Point series because really one of our missions is to create this dialogue between the community here, the art community here, and the international art community. And we realized that really through conducting these public programs, we can offer the local community an opportunity to dialogue, to learn from professionals in the field abroad. And I hope you will enjoy tonight's discussion.
So very broadly, we're going to be talking about curatorial models in a post-multicultural world, which basically is a way of talking about how internationalism through the art world affects local context, which is obviously a huge theme. And we're going to zero in on 3 different specific examples from which to talk about this. Our first speaker is Levenson, who is the director of the international program at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and he's going to focus on that exciting program. Yara Sonseca Mas will follow up with her work as head of exhibitions at La Casa Encendida in Madrid, which is a private nonprofit multidisciplinary center focused on contemporary culture and environmental and social issues. And Erin Gleeson will talk about Sasa and her work in Cambodia. So first up is Levenson, please.
Thank you. I want to thank Artis for bringing me here, and also the CCA for organizing this evening. I'm going to talk about my own department, the international program, which, as you'll see, started out sort of as essentially a curatorial department. I've sort of taken it a different direction over the last 17 years that I've been at MoMA. It's the longest job I've ever had. So, let me start out with a bit of history, which I think would be helpful. Here's just the sort of current state of my department. I just took 2 snapshots from recent programs, one showing a well-known concrete poet, Augusto de Campos from Brazil, giving a talk to one of our research groups, and another at the right, which was a presentation of one of the books that we publish. But basically, the department now is essentially something like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of MoMA. It's outreach to institutions outside the country and has a variety of different types of initiatives. But let me go back a bit in time. Oh, and also I should say right at the outset, one of the great advantages we have in doing our work is we have a large donors support group. That's just a small cross-section of them. It's called the International Council. It started out just about the time that the department was founded, and it's grown to over 200 people. So their contributions to the museum, dues and other contributions, support not only my department's initiatives, but also other international initiatives through the museum. So some of the work that I've done really benefited from having an internal source of income at the museum. Originally, the department was started in 1952, sort of as a traveling exhibition service. Nelson Rockefeller, who was a very international person, was the president of MoMA. René Donencourt, who was born in Austria and was also a very international person, was the director. And they had the idea of a department that would share the museum's collections with the world, but also help make American artists better known outside the United States. And this started in 1952 with the department organizing a fairly amazing number of international traveling exhibitions, generally from the museum's own collections. This was one of the first shows, 12 Modern American Painters and Sculptors, which you can see Jackson Pollock, Calder. It introduced some of the abstract expressionists to Europe. At that time, rather remarkably, they weren't well known outside of the United States, really outside of New York. There is an idea, which can't be substantiated and really can't be contradicted, that there was a CIA initiative behind these exhibitions. That it was part of a government strategy in competition with the Russians, who after all were socialist realists, to show that America was a free society, because look at what our painters did. They created art that nobody could understand, so a complete demonstration of intellectual freedom. Needless to say, there's no documentation on either side proving or disproving this idea. My own feeling is the people at MoMA surely knew that they were working in a Cold World environment, and they knew that at a certain point they were in competition, with other great propaganda programs of the period. But I can't believe that they picked abstract expressionism specifically for its propaganda value, because the museum was acquiring great numbers of abstract expressionist works at the time. It was really the school that the museum had sort of thrown in its lot with, and I have to believe that was the origin of this exhibition program. The other thing that the department took over was representation of the United States in important international exhibitions. So actually it bought the American Pavilion from an artists cooperative that had owned it. The United States has no Department of Culture. There is no Ministry of Culture. And so private organizations had to step in to do the things that were done on a governmental level in other countries. And actually for about 10 years, the international program ran it didn't pick all the artists. It also involved other museums, but it administered the American Pavilion, and it also did the same thing with American representation in the Sao Paulo Biennale. Eventually, the American Pavilion was sold, I think, for a symbolic $1 to the Guggenheim, since they already had a museum in Venice and had an easier time of running this pavilion. Here's the Sao Paulo Biennale. Amazing shows were sent. There was a huge Jackson Pollock show that was sent in 1957 to the fourth Biennale, which was his introduction to South America. Knowing the value of some of these paintings now, the insurance value is a little hard to see how something like this could be done anymore, but it was done on a very regular basis, when the department started. The most famous and the most widely seen exhibition, it's thought it was seen by over 6 million people, was the photography show, The Family of Man, which was circulated both by the museum and by the United States State Department in 3 versions around the world for something like 2 years. It was Steichen's exhibition when he was director of the chief curator of photography at MoMA, and since all of the works were special prints for the exhibition, it was much easier to circulate than typical archival exhibitions. When I started at the museum, this program I felt was sort of coming to an end, mostly because it really wasn't possible to connect the museum to the world just through exhibitions. I felt that A lot of the shows really, by this time, weren't organized in my department. They were organized in the different curatorial departments, and they were really going to the same, I would guess, about 15 major international museums, most of which were in Europe, some in Japan. Really because in the intervening years, the insurance values of these works had jumped. People were very much aware of conservation issues, so these shows could only go to the museums that had the facilities and in some cases the budgets to receive them. And the museum wanted to concentrate the exhibition program in a single department, which I thought was appropriate. So I really had to find a new mission for the museum. And I thought what the program really had done was to connect the museum to the wider world, and if it couldn't be done appropriately through exhibitions, there should be other programs. So I started out with a series of museum professionals workshops. We did them once every year. Started with a Latin American workshop, then did Central and Eastern Europe, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. Each year we'd invite about 15 curators and other museum professionals to spend 2 weeks with us, where we had a program of their meeting with virtually every department in the exhibition, mostly focused on exhibition practice. We actually, I don't have a slide, but we were actually invited back by one of the Asian participants and did a similar program in Hong Kong in 2002 for East Asian and Southeast Asian museum professionals. They worked rather well for sort of getting our message out. They weren't very effective in getting information about these parts of the world to our curators. You know, basically with a group of 15 people, we'd ask them all to talk about their place of origin. Each one was supposed to speak about 15 minutes, and I'm quite focused on that tonight. But they inevitably spoke for half an hour, and no one could sit through all of the talk. So it just didn't work quite the way I'd hoped. We followed up with more focused curatorial conferences, also with education conferences we did more recently, connecting specific regions. We did a curatorial conference on the Middle East. We did education conferences on Mexico and Brazil. And we still do occasional activities like that, so that stayed as part of our program. Most recent one was actually this past summer. We invited 8 sort of senior curators and 4 MoMA curators to participate in a very focused 2-week workshop, which involved mornings of business school lectures from professors at Columbia Business School and afternoon sessions with MoMA staff and at other museums. And we're going to try to keep that going too. It's amazingly expensive because we have to bring in the business school professors, but it really created a great relationship between our curators and their international colleagues, and everyone found it valuable. The business school courses they were developed by another organization called the Center for Curatorial Leadership that works in New York, and they really condensed a lot of knowledge of business practices into very concise morning programs. So everybody found it extremely valuable and something we'll try to keep on going forward. This was just the list of participants, but I handpicked this particular group and looking for individuals whom I knew personally and also institutions whom I thought could be good long-term partners in different directions for the museum. I'm sort of worried about picking the next group because I didn't hold back and picked the people I knew the best for the first one. We've also started, just around the time we started doing those museum professional workshops, a series of documentary publications. I asked one of our curators, Laura Hopman, who'd worked with Central and Eastern Europe, what could we do outside of exhibitions that would be useful? And she said if you translated primary documents like artists' writings and early criticism into English, it would actually be something useful both in the United States and also in Eastern Europe, because the languages are so many and so complicated that nobody knows more than 2 or 3. And English is the common language for the region. So it turned out to be an extremely difficult project. It's the book Primary Documents all the way on the left. It took several years because until we translated the documents, we couldn't really be certain that they were worth including in in the publication, because they came in something like 12 or 13 different languages, which is it's a very expensive way to put together a book of translations, I can assure you. But it worked very well. It really started the museum on a path of collaboration with Eastern Europe that hardly had existed before. And we followed it up with a series of publications, several on Latin America. The next one, Listen Here Now, was on Argentina in the 60s. The next one was on a sort of a key figure in the development of criticism in Venezuela. We did one on important documents of modern Swedish design. And then the last two that came out were on Asia, one on China since the 1970s, and another on post-war Japan. And these really, we were able to involve MoMA staff in some of these publications, and these really sort of created the flow of information that I'd been hoping for when I started the program. We have two already in progress, one on Brazil, Mario Pedrosa, a very important critic who's never been translated before into English. And another, for the first time, we're actually collaborating with one of our exhibition projects, a show on Latin American architecture. And there'll be a separate book of documents of Latin American architecture that will be published next year in conjunction with the show. Another really important initiative, I can't claim credit for it, it was the idea of Kathy Halbreich, who came to MoMA from the Walker Arts Center several years ago. And she has this sort of slightly undefined position as associate director. And we'd always wanted to do a research institute, but I had always thought it would have to be something like the Gettys Institute, with scholars coming for an academic year. In fact, that's something that's extremely difficult to finance in New York. If you can just imagine putting people up for months at a time. And we just didn't have the space within the museum to get something like that started. And Kathy suggested doing something starting on a much more modest level. So the way this research process works, she started 3 curatorial groups, which we administer through my department, one focusing on Latin America, one on Central and Eastern Europe, and one on Asia, which were the 3 areas we'd sort of always marked off. They invite scholars and artists to come for relatively short sessions in New York, really just a few days, to meet with the research groups, which each one's about a dozen curators from all the different departments. Occasionally there's a public program. They also invite people from local universities. Depending on the department, they have 1 or 2 sessions a month. And then they take group trips to the area they're studying. So it's been an extremely effective way of getting people involved and knowledgeable about areas that they knew very little about before the program. One of the aspects of the program is we got a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and we were able to engage 3 postdoctoral fellows, one for each section. And together they edit a new website called Post that was started essentially for this program. You can find it at post.moma.org. And it's meant to be a discussion forum. I'd say the discussions are a little slow in starting, but I've learned that's fairly typical for this type of undertaking. But it's a way of publishing some of the talks. We record them, and we're able to turn them essentially into slide lectures using the PowerPoints that our speakers have brought. It records the impressions of our curators as they take these trips. It's a start, but it's been a way of sharing the knowledge that's been acquired through this program with a wider audience. And it definitely has a discussion forum, which is very easy to enter. We just wish more people would enter it. So that's essentially an overview of what the activities of the department have been. It's always hard to write it down, on an envelope, as you're supposed to with like any good mission, because it's really a variety of different programs. But they're all aimed at the same thing, getting the museum to move its focus, which traditionally has very much been on the United States and Western Europe, and even on certain parts of Western Europe, to the world at large. And it's already started to have real effects to some extent with the exhibitions. There'll be an exhibition on 2 Argentine photographers, for example, this spring, that results directly from travel done by some of the 2 curators to Latin America. It's also really influenced acquisitions. Curators, there's no expectation that the curators will, present any particular type of work. This is meant to be a research project that leads wherever it leads, but curators naturally gravitate towards acquisitions in a museum like ours. And we counted recently something like 400 acquisitions over the last few years that can be traced directly to the CMAT program. So, it's a start. It's a large institution, and this type of initiative takes a while to have, deep effects. But we're pretty confident that it will have very long and lasting effects over the coming years. So that's the overview. Thanks for your attention, and we'll move to the next speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for all of you for coming tonight. Thank you very much, Chen, Tamir, for your invitation, and Artis for bringing me here. Well, No? Can you hear me now? Yeah? Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. Okay, English is not my native language, so I'm going to read my talk, and I hope you can understand me. Well, I'm here representing La Casa Encendida, and from our point of view, the key to success is to know who you are, to know where you are, which are your limits, which are your real values, and in addition to that, how far you can dream and experiment. When La Casa Encendida opened in the popular neighborhood of Lavapiés in central Madrid in 2003, there was virtually no space for contemporary culture and fine arts in Madrid other than Museo Reina Sofía. And that's a museum with all its heaviness and bureaucracy, but also with its bigger capacity to produce ambitious projects. At that time, and still nowadays, La Casa aimed to be an open space where everybody could feel at home, growing intellectually and sensitive, but also enjoying life and integrating cultural experiences as a positive attitude, or even better, as a routine in their daily lives. The audiences we expect and we aim to create are similar to the good readers, those who simply dedicate a certain amount of time every day to nurturing their brains and their spirits. It wasn't easy, it is not easy, and we discuss constantly in our very small team about the strategies. Actually, we are on risk of developing multiple personalities in our efforts to satisfy artists, guest curators, dancers, DJs, NGOs, environmentalists, kids, scholars, etc. But before continuing, I want to show you a short video from our past activities. Well, now that you hopefully got an idea about the dynamic spirit of the center, I would talk a little bit about our structure. I have never been a strong believer in the benefits of PowerPoints, and devices of that sort. FaceTime and personal debate have always seemed more productive and less mechanic to me. And since I'm here and you are here, listening for the time being at least, I believe that we can very well do without it. La Casa Encendida is a non-profit institution supported by private money of Monte Madrid Foundation. We receive around 800,000 visitors per year. 128,000 people follow us in Facebook. Our exhibition space has 700 square meters. We count with an auditorium, a screening room, a terrace, and a big courtyard, around 7,000 square meters in total. That's to give you an idea of the dimension of the space, which is, I guess, not big, not small. La Casa has been built on 4 main researching areas: cultural, environmental studies, social studies, and education. Cultural department includes exhibitions and fine arts, my responsibility, performing arts, film department, literature and thought. We also manage a resource center which serves ourselves, and at the same time it is open to everybody, including a media center, recording studios, radio station and photography darkroom. The environmental department organizes any kind of educational activities to promote consciousness on our natural resources and respect of nature. The social department gives voice to any group on social exclusion or in danger of it, from people in a later stage of their lives to disabled people or immigrant communities. The educational department gives supports during the whole year through the library and its activities and the languages courses, going from Spanish for immigrants to Internet for beginners, usually over 60 years old. All these areas work independently, aiming to do their best in their fields of expertise. At the same time, we try to work together, supporting each other in our interests, trying to create common grounds for shared audiences, even fighting, to tell you the truth, for audiences among ourselves. Coming back to the cultural area, and more specifically to the exhibition department of which I am the head, I will give some examples of how we try to link our projects to other areas. I will talk about exhibitions produced in order to support programs developed by other departments, and in general terms, how our institution and programming try to connect meaningfully to our local audience, counting on people, neighborhood communities, critics, scholars, tourists, kids, even confused pedestrians who just happen to drop by. This is a short video where you can see more clean our spaces, so you can have an idea. Talking about how we link the exhibition department to other areas, I would like to extend myself on 2 projects, which might work as examples or case studies. The site-specific intervention, the Dutch designer Petra Bles presented at La Casa in 2010, and the workshop and public projection created by North American photographer Zoe Strauss in 2009. Petra Bles and her studio, Inside Outside, have been designing interiors since 1991, always playing with nature, opening windows from the inside to the outside and the other way around. When she visited Madrid for the first time, we were amazed about her perception of the city. She was shocked by the singing of Madrilenian birds. Maybe it was because she came in spring. But the truth is that her perception was right, and her intuition confirmed by our environmental department, in the sense that the number of nesting and migrant birds species in our town is higher than in other European capital, because we are very close to the National Park of Mountains of Guadarrama. With the help of an ornithological association, we found out numbers, photographs, and lots of information that Petra exposed in her intervention, turning the space into a huge device that would enable connections with the city from a different perspective. As we usually do, accordingly with our pedagogical aim, we suggest her to give a workshop, part of our strategy to open the possibility for audiences to go deeper in a subject if they feel like it after enjoying what they have seen in a particular show or exhibit. She agreed to share her knowledge on fabric and textile processing and her environmental respectful philosophy. She gave us the guidelines. We found a partner, the textile designers Peseta, a tiny manufacturer based in Madrid, a young team of designers working on recycling, who had even gotten the fashion mogul Marc Jacobs interested in their work at their very small laboratoire in our city. Together we reused all materials of Petro's site-specific project once the exhibition was finished. From the outside, Netherlands, to the inside, Madrid, to the outside again, throwing new products worldwide while teaching and sharing knowledge and know-how. Next example on co-working is a project we developed with Zoe Strauss in 2009. She's Zoe. The case here was very different. The city asked us to participate in an event called Nuit Blanche, or White Night, an European initiative promoting late openings and cultural events from one night very autumn. The question was how to transform an institutional tool launched and monitored by the City Council into something else that might prove useful and endurable beyond that very night itself. We got in touch with Zoe and planned a workshop together. She documents exclusion groups, poverty and extreme conditions in Philadelphia. What we organized was a live photography workshop where students, with the support of our social department, showed and guided Zoe through conflictive areas in Madrid. Following that, they selected and discussed the better works together. We print out posters of them and fix them in the neighborhood. While working together, the students and Zoe found an amazing abandoned place nearby La Casa Encendida, a site where a building had been torn down years ago. The site was owned by the City Council. La Casa got in touch with authorities to obtain the permissions for the projection of the works. That night, the site was opened, the common wall was screened, and from then on, the site is a garden managed by neighborhood communities in the area. Let's talk now about the exhibitions we produce supporting the program of other areas in our institution. This is about being the side dish, relatively speaking, in terms of the project as a whole, while continuing to serve a main course all the same. To illustrate the case, I will talk briefly about two exhibitions: John Cage's installation Writing Through the Easy on the Duty of Civil Disobedience, 2006, and the exhibition Mundo Extreme, 2013. The first one was planned to wrap up, warm up, and create a context for the music festival the Performing Arts Department had developed, dedicated to Cage and his followers. But how to ignore his legacy in the fine arts? We brought the installation he designed for Documenta 8 in 1987 from Kunsthalle Bremen in Germany. The installation was a net knit by lights, recording voice, moving chairs, a daily changeable net that I'm sure our security staff members still remember, daily changing the chairs from here to there in an impossible chessboard. In the end, it worked as a basso continuo of sorts, accompanying the festival. It also was the perfect excuse to reprint Toros' text on the duty of civil disobedience in Spanish, which had inspired Cage this marvelous piece. The exhibition Mundo Extreme, that we are looking at now, doesn't fit with the topic we are focusing on, in the sense that no international art took part on the show. But I wanted to mention it because it is one of the most successful collaborative projects we have ever developed. During the last 10 years, we've been offering creativity workshops for mentally disabled people with the help of the Spanish organization Debajo del Sombrero. After 10 years, we launched an exhibition of the works of this undiscovered and unclassifiable artist. It was a fulfilling exercise in integration. We asked them to participate in the installing, to talk to our guides, to receive the journalists, to live the whole experience with us. Some of their works have been selected by the Museum of Everything, a British non-profit organization, and will be part of their next big show celebrated during Frieze Art Fair in London. And from time to time, we celebrate the recent past as a way to get our younger audiences acquainted with internationally renowned artists who opened new paths to contemporary creation. And of course, without forgetting to be ambitious all the same and looking at them from new perspectives that might be of interest to scholars and more specialized audience. In 2007, Andy Warhol started our 5th anniversary. We wanted to do a bit more than just buying a show from the Andy Warhol Museum. So we invited a very renowned Spanish scholar and curator on the field of postmodernism and American pop art, Estrella de Diego. She proposed a show to create an exhibition around the notion of identity in Warhol's work. The exhibition focused on Warhol's self-portrait and portraits of him made by other artists in his circle, assuming that ultimately he himself and no other was the director in charge of staging his own mise en scène. A film program, workshops, guided tours, a music festival were part of the celebration. More than 200 works procedent from the Guggenheim collection, MoMA Vienna, Museum Kunstpalast Düsseldorf, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Walker Art Center Minneapolis, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, among other institutions. In our 10th anniversary, in 2012, we showed an ambitious survey on the last 10 years of work in Louis Bourgeois' career. Daniel Tilkin, a French art historian and curator based in New York, was in charge of the exhibition. Through Bourgeois' late work, we discovered her beginnings. A selection of documentary films was screened every week, and during the weekends, while the exhibition was on show, we programmed contemporary, experimental, and auteur films by women. Filmmakers who shared with her a certain way of transforming vital experiences into intimate but universal artworks. In between Warhol and Bourgeois, we celebrate modern Russia in 2011 with the exhibition Red Cavalry, borrowing the title from Malevich. Again, we tried to approach the subject from a point of view which went beyond the classical avant-garde exhibitions. Rosa Ferré, an expert in comparative and Russian literature, was our guest curator. The exhibition drew a path from Lenin to Stalin, from the illusion of creating a new world for new people to the perversion of the system when suddenly creation wasn't a free exercise anymore. A project telling us through literature, music, painting, films about the past but also about the present, an occasion to rethink about political and economic control strategies in arts and life. We designed an audio guide in cooperation with La Cité de la Musique, the bigger institution in France dedicated to music in Paris, including experimental music, Shostakovich and Prokofiev scores, to follow the evolution of that language. A catalogue with international collaborators such as Dmitry Rodionov, Pascal Wien, Vitaly Sentalinsky, or John Wiley, among others. A contemporary classical music festival, a Russian experimental music festival, an avant-garde Russian performances selection, guided tours, educational workshops, etc. I hope all the previous examples have been useful to show who we are. I would like to end by saying that La Casa Encendida works around the assumption of a very visible and very present change in the individual and collective approach to knowledge. Very aware of how our society links concepts, disciplines, and experiences since the internet and new media and technologies have changed our way of life and keep changing it at a distinct speed. How to deepen our approach to vital topics and concerns of nowadays ever-changing societies without taking into account the variety of expressions, the amazing amount of information we all receive daily. It's not easy. We do our best, aiming to spread the ability for community debates and individual capacity for critique, as well as a desire of self-improvement in our community with the help from international and local artists working together. Also with the help of international institutions like, for example, MoMA, who in 2009 actually, through Yay, they lent us part of the great photography collection. So we try to work mixing international and local artists, audiences, collaborations. As I said in the beginning, I hope you had got an idea of whom we are and where we are, which are our aspirations and goals. It shouldn't be on me to determine up to which point we have succeeded and what are our achievements. That will be up to you when you all come to Madrid, where I hope to receive you at La Casa very soon. As we said in Spanish, mi casa es tu casa. Thank you very much.
I'll begin with a reflection, quite a different approach, a reflection on this invitation from Chen. Instead of focusing specifically on what I was supposed to, which was residency programs, I decided to dedicate the second half after my reflection to a project, one of our projects called Sasa Art Projects, in light of the building the government just announced it wants to demolish the building. So I'd rather talk about that because it's very depressing. So to begin with, I'm originally from Minneapolis. Better? I've lived and worked in Cambodia for 13 years. I'm a co-founder and first artistic director of a place called Sasa. We're a nonprofit, tiny institution with 60 square meters of exhibition space. But we, you know, when I hear CCA talk, or when I hear Jay talk, or when I hear the talks about other institutions, it's like we try to be that big, but we're so tiny. I won't really talk about what we do because I'll go to look at some artwork, but yeah, I'll get into it later. Earlier this year, I was asked for the first time to reflect on my curatorial practice as it relates to cultural exchange. In the words of the synopsis that was drafted by the host at that time, I was supposed to discuss, in quote, mediating a culture that is not one's own. And in editing the synopsis, I added the word originally before one's own. So to mediate a culture that is not originally one's own. And then I felt I should have changed it to mediate in a culture that is originally not one's own. And then the term mediate and the term culture became very problematic too. And I realized that this idea of cultural exchange is so impossible to speak about, let alone mediate. When I received Chen's prompt for the topic tonight, especially the 3 questions that we will try to discuss afterwards, to be honest, I felt as if she might be spying on me. The questions are very, very relevant to the core of my everyday. Not only that, she posed them as if they were normal, as if post-multiculturalism was real, and that I don't have to feel like a foreigner anymore. I could be one, like everyone else. Yeah, and feeling like so relaxed for a second, I was thinking that I missed some kind of like global trend to post-multiculturalism, because in Cambodia the last 14 years I missed a lot of things while I learned a lot of other things. So I had a discussion with my colleagues at Sasa and other curators or scholars working in Cambodia. Are we post-multicultural? What does this mean? And we decided not at all. While Cambodia is extremely cosmopolitan, it almost always has been. It's very international. It's very foreigner-friendly. It is definitely not a post-multicultural zone. It's on the verge of industrialization, not post-industrialization. It is a post-traumatic zone, but it is not yet post-multicultural. So it is the histories of occupation that are unresolved and ongoing that made me sensitive, hypersensitive to Chen's questions. So as it does, each political period has its own agenda for culture, and I just will walk you through very briefly, it's impossible, Cambodia's. From the control of artisans and artists during the reign of god kings during Angkor, to the subsequent monarchies afterwards, to the French imposition of Angkorian aesthetics on a totally different time and place, to glorify their own colony, to the Japanese occupation in the 40s, to the US destruction of the country through the 60s and 70s, to the Khmer Rouge, to the Vietnamese rule through the 1980s, to the UN's rule in the 1990s, and today to the rule of tourism and foreign investment. Cambodia is marketed as both a culture of luxury and suffering. And as during the French protectorate for 150 years and subsequent occupations that I just mentioned, the foreigner is not coming to work within Cambodian infrastructures per se, but rather to impose, implement, monitor, capacity build, audit within an international system that was not previously there. So power makes what we do, power makes what we know to be culture today out of what it can best access that complements its structures. And in Cambodia, fabrications of new understandings of culture are coming from UNESCO, the larger UN body, international courts, NGOs, therapy centers, international schools, international coffee houses, Thai soap operas, Korean pop music, from East and West. There was a brief and incredible period of independence in Cambodia from 1954 to 1970. And that could be much more celebrated, and so I want to kind of conclude with that. The period of post-colonial articulation during independence was interrupted by the Cold War, the US bombing, the Khmer Rouge, and the recovery. It's estimated that 90% of artists and all educated people were killed by the year of 1979. So I've met with the former Minister of Culture at that time who took a helicopter around to each province to try to find out who survived, and his estimate is that 90% of artists were murdered. In a condition of absence like this comes a metaphor from Hannah Arendt of a staircase without a banister, like a path with very little support. She said that during such a period, actions and stories are needed to, quote, create the common world in which we live together. That this being together is perhaps the true idea of culture. Today, culture is increasingly removed from the things one does every day to something someone experiences by going somewhere to encounter what someone else did or thought. This is still not the case in Cambodia, where there is no museum, nothing necessarily to go to that is the other. So while culture is still considered the everyday, is food, is mannerisms, is language, is land, religion, etc., it reminds me, following the artist reminding me, to work from home, home being Cambodia, without much regard to audiences elsewhere. It's like the antithesis of what I'm supposed to say as a curator, to disregard audiences. But I'll explain that a little bit. Sasa Basak has been open for 3 years. It was founded by 6 artists and myself. We've commissioned 30 new bodies of work, at least. We've hosted over 50 public programs, and all related to the exhibiting artist or theme or project. The artists tend to engage what is missing from the apprehension of their culture otherwise. So it is beyond Angkor, and it is beyond the Khmer Rouge. They are trying to introduce culture itself, perhaps like conscious and unconscious experiences of everyday life. And that list that I just made of language, stories from the past, the present, soundscapes, religious practice, land, eviction, urbanization. It makes contemporary artists in Cambodia, I believe, some of the very first critical voices post-Khmer Rouge period. They're using cameras a lot, they're using bodies a lot, video, and these materials are sourced from their home, from the content of their lives. So I just want to look, and I want to use the website because I want you to use the website. I'll show you how easy it is we look like a gallery in a lot of ways. One of our roles as a nonprofit is to look like a gallery somehow. We want to trick people in that maybe we're like a real gallery, because we're trying to like serve all roles, like institution, gallery, representative, gallery taking care of the careers, but we have no collectors, or we have no mechanism for sales. So, for example, I'll show you 3 examples. This is one work from Kwai Sam Nang. I'll take the most recent work. He's following land evictions, these being a legacy of the French colony who made reservations for indigenous people in 20 years ago, 1920, and really conceptually shifted the consciousness about nature to land and to the commodification of land. And so Sam Nang is walking through these rubber plantations, stealing rubber, from the oldest rubber plantations to the very newest, which are mainly on the Vietnamese-Cambodian border from Chinese and Vietnamese companies. And he's pouring this bucket of rubber over his head. Another example, I go to some exhibitions. For example, the fence is a brand new landscape in Cambodia. It might look very typical to all of you, but it is really, really, I don't know if we have an exhibition view. Yeah, so this was the exhibition. The idea is to really let the artists do absolutely anything they want. So instead of showing a very traditional photography exhibition, he decided to build a fence. You know, it does not have to be sellable. And so you could not really walk so well in the gallery, which meant that it really reflected what was going on outside. So privatization of land is a very new thing in the city. And the artist continues this work. So we hosted his second exhibition that was also about the fencing in Cambodia, in the city. He came back from a residency in New York, and he built this fence, just mimicking the very fence that was now on the street. So within 1 year, the fences went from these banal corrugated color fields to these very entertaining LED landscapes of flowers and Angkor Wat, you know, with the daily life, the nightlife passing through. Another artist who you might know, we had a win in Documenta last time with 3 Cambodian artists, is a work by Vendi Ratana, who's looking at the American bombing of Cambodia. My country dropped 2 million tons of bombs over 4 to 6 years on a neutral country. So he's taken very quiet portraits. And these have been shown worldwide. So just to show you a few approaches of the kind of stories that the artists are trying to access that are not necessarily known or apprehended, you know, how people think about Cambodia. So in Cambodia, there's no institution to take care of contemporary artists or artworks. There's no funds, there's no fellowships, there's not a national collection, there are a few studios, there is one outdated university. There are around 100 contemporary artists in a country of 15 million, in which half of them are under the age of 30. Around 15 of those artists are getting to be quite well known in the region, Southeast Asian region or East Asian region, through biennials and triennials, but there are also maybe a handful are becoming known internationally. So I've watched and had a big role, of course, over the last 13 years in a lot of change, and I stress the word change rather than exchange. I cannot discuss all the pros and cons of all of this change, but I feel I must be very sensitive in my curatorial practice to be where I am now, to know and to work from what came before me, and to do that I have the very simplest strategy, and that is to work for the one who knows more than I know, and that being the artist. So while my curatorial practice in Cambodia at Sasa Basak and also off-site is indeed fitting objects, ideas into a semblance that can be like internationally recognized, communicable, put into post-multicultural worlds too, that's part of my job, is to show that, you know, they are ready or can connect in different environments, different dialogues. I like to keep in mind that the curatorial practice is a temporary mechanism of understanding. And thankfully for now, that role can negotiate space in which artists can offset and upset the imaginary of Cambodia. I'm going to take 5 minutes, if possible, even though I know I have 3, to introduce this project called Sasa Art Projects. Sasa is an acronym for Sti of Silabak, which means Art Rebels, and it's one of Cambodia's first and only active collectives. They came together as photographers in 2007 to challenge the representation of Cambodia through the image, and to challenge the absence of education, and to say that we can self-teach, or we must self-teach. The STIAV members were born and raised into an era of politically restricted education systems. In the 80s, it was sanctions from the whole world because the United States demanded that. The collective's initial purpose was to build a community, share knowledge, build a small library, and basically try to fill gaps. I came together with this collective years later to, keep filling gaps, and we still together fill gaps. The Sasa Art Projects is located in a very special place called the White Building. This building was constructed, and this was Phnom Penh in the 1960s. This was the White Building. It was the first high-rise for civil servants in the city. It was constructed, the whole area was called Front du Basak, and it was constructed, designed by Van Mollivan, who was an urban planner very inspired by Corbusier, had studied in Paris. This is the White Building today. This was the original White Building. It's considered now a slum. However, it's a very, very vibrant community in which carries a very important history of being the place where the king resettled the surviving artists after the Khmer Rouge. And so it's a very fecund place to try to raise another generation or educate a new generation of Cambodian artists, because the parents are very open to art education. There are currently 10 people who enrolled in the National Art Program out of those 2 million who can choose what they want to study. And so Sti of Silabak, this group of artists, started their own informal school, and it is from there that new artists are coming, being taught by young other artists. Sasa Art Projects has 4 main areas of programming in 2 spaces. One is this, an apartment, like this apartment, has been reconstructed into like a white cube, how it originally was, even though the outside is not there. And another apartment, which is the archive. And then they have a residency program called Pisau, means residency. And the focus is trying to do a lot of regional work. Because it is so site-specific, it is not cool to just have anybody in that building. First of all, not a lot of people want to stay there. But it must be really, really relevant to the community, not necessarily to the artist's practice. The artists ask the artists to try something new that is directly inspired from their time in that community. The residencies have proven to shed the judgment and the stigma in and of the neighborhood, to build and extend various forms of knowledge, to build intimate and ongoing relationships and networks with the neighborhood. And like the practices of the artist Sti of Silabak, now the community itself is really responsive to the issues that they're facing, like eviction. At Sasa Art Projects, the curatorial is collaborative between all involved in a given project. Most often the project spills out into the 2 spaces, to the neighborhood, hallways, stairwells, cafes, salons. There were 1,000 people traveling through this building for some of the events. While Sasa Basak is a nonprofit, they specify firmly that they are not a non-governmental organization. They do not swallow ideas of sustainability that many other NGOs do. Rather, they self-define like their location as being an experimental mechanism. Sti of Silabak is not trying to save the building by educating people in the building or experimenting and questioning what art is. The director states that they strive to replace permanent communities of place and ideas of temporary communities of action. Steve strives to create a new fabric for everyday experience of life, and one that erases the boundaries between the artistic sphere and the political one. The Sasa Art Projects makes positive impact in immeasurable ways relating to countless and overlapping demographics, practices, and histories, including individuals, families, intergenerational dialogues, youth, queer communities, women, artists, art histories, urban histories, etc. This very unique project in Cambodia is really serving in every way to resist the past and current regimes of power. So in conclusion, I'd like to raise the idea of an essay by Levinas. It's titled The Philosophical Determination of the Idea of Culture. And I really love this idea because it's not about the philosophical determination of culture. It's about the philosophical determination of the idea of culture. And I feel that it relates well to what we try to do both at Sasa Basak and Sasa Art Projects, because we're trying to evolve to change as the needs are changing very rapidly for the artists. But we are determined to question all along what is the meaningful idea of culture as it relates to the everyday in Cambodia for the artists, and if and how it translates to regional and international, not that it necessarily has to. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. So Angela Merkel is famous for saying, she's famous for many reasons, but she also recently said that German multiculturalism has utterly failed. This is her position these 2 years ago. And I'm assuming she means domestic policy, but we can also read it as ideology. This idea that bringing people together is good, that we can grow through cultural exchange, that, this idea maybe seems challenged by all the strife that we see happening and continuously happening in contemporary life, not just in politics, but also in politics. Things like French teenagers joining ISIS in Syria. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for us to reconsider multiculturalism. And I don't want to get too harped on this term, post-multiculturalism, but to look at the challenges and maybe the interesting failures and successes of cultural exchange and through the work that we do. So maybe if you could respond to this as kind of as cultural brokers, if you will, or cultural bridges. I know, Erin, you just did, but maybe we can hear from Jay.
Well, my own goals within the museum are, relatively modest. So certainly not on the order of what I assume Angela Merkel's goals are, whatever they may be. But basically, I'm working in an institution, that sort of started a particular narrative of Western art history, which was so successful, it kind of dominated the institution's consciousness for decades after it was sort of first defined, starting in the 1930s, and it wasn't so. I mean, it's mostly traceable back to the founding director, Alfred Barr, who actually was very open to a lot of different cultures. There are, interestingly, pockets of non-Western art in the collection that hardly anybody knows about. In fact, one of the things that we've done through these different research programs is rediscover parts of our collection which are there, which the current generation of curators have forgotten about. They're actually important early South African paintings from the 1950s and prints. There was a very strong collection of Japanese photography and also graphic work from the 60s having to do with exhibitions that were put on then. So it's not completely a one-dimensional edifice sort of erected by Alfred Barr starting in the 1930s, but still, I'd say, and particularly in the generation after Alfred Barr, it really became very concentrated on Western European art and particularly on art from New York. So my own goals have been just, basically to loosen things up. It's interesting, but curators don't get as many chances to travel to areas outside their original research fields. In our museum, except through my department, there aren't that many budgets that allow people to travel anywhere unless they have a project. So once an exhibition is accepted, and there's a committee of the chief curators and the director who pass on that, the exhibition gets a budget including a research allowance for travel. Curators also travel as couriers of works of art. Outside of that, they need help. Of course, how do you get the travel you need to a new place that you've never been to before so that you can put together a proposal for an exhibition? So that's one area where sort of the different initiatives we have helped. I should say, in addition to those CMAP travel budgets, we have a special budget for travel to Latin America, set up by one of our trustees. We've had budgets for travel to Eastern Europe set up the same way. So that's sort of it's one thing that we can do to help. And the other thing is to bring people to New York for contact with these curators so they can learn about places, not quite firsthand, but almost firsthand, at least from someone who has firsthand knowledge, even before they go there. So, I mean, that's my sort of small attempt at bringing a broader perspective to the museum. But the way our museum works, whether it's an acquisition or an exhibition, it has to come from a curator. We have something like 50 curators. It's relatively rare that we would have a guest curator solely responsible for an exhibition. So there really needs to be some mechanism for our people to broaden their experience, and that's where my programs play a role, I think.
Well, in my case, this question about multiculturality, the neighborhood where we are located is actually multicultural, if you want to call it like that, because it's a very popular neighborhood. It used to be, is one of the traditional neighborhoods in Madrid, in the center, so there are a lot of old people living there, but it was also cheap. So when the immigrants start coming to Spain, which was pretty recently, we cannot compare with New York or any other country, because we've been, as you, I guess you know, there was a very heavy dictator in Spain till 1977. So till Franco died, and then we start to develop as a country and then become part of the European community. Spain was kind of very isolated. So I still remember, like, the first time that I saw people of other races in the subway, and I thought, oh, we are a developed country. No? It was like a revelation. And when this happened, we were obviously not prepared. And from La Casa Encendida, where I work, we thought that the best way to be open to that is just to create a space comfortable for anyone. But at the same time, you cannot keep this multiculturality, or I don't know how to say, very much, because you feel that the foreign people that are coming, what they want is to be integrated. So it's very difficult because they really want to be part of your society very quick. And how to stimulate them to share their own culture or the background they bring with them, instead of just burying all that part and become a Spaniard or European individualities immediately, no? That's very difficult. The only recipe we found is just to be open-minded, to try to just be, like normal, easygoing, open as much as we can. And we are a produce center. It's very different. We are not a museum. We are not collecting. But we made competition for artists based in Spain or Spanish. That meaning, that I didn't talk about that, but because it was not on the focus on. But meaning that if you live there, you can be part of it, and things like that. Trying to be open, but it's the only way we, I don't know, further than philosophical consideration is how we've been working from now.
I quickly mentioned what I was going to speak about, which was residencies, and I find that residencies are the answer to impossibility of exchange. So I don't really believe in cultural exchange on a kind of whole. I believe in a very individual sense. So I was part of a really crazy thing called Season of Cambodia, in which like 200 Cambodian artists were dropped on New York last year. And instead of making a big show, I made a residency program for the visual artists. Performing arts is different because you must make a show. That's what you do. But instead of actually making that show, we partnered with MoMA, and we made the first ever conference, artistry conference on Cambodian art, but also let each artist themselves discover their own cultural exchange. And I think residencies allow you to do that. And then from that became, for each artist, such a growth, such a big growth, because they can navigate it on their own terms without this agenda of cultural exchange. And so then we pushed this further into a collaboration with educators, curators, artists from New Zealand and Cambodia, and started with that question of cultural exchange. Being like, oh, let's do an exhibition. That's what it means. You exhibit here, New Zealand here, Cambodia, we exhibit there, we make a book, pop, pop, pop. And then, we had a cultural exchange. But we started to deconstruct this, and eventually Vera May is my co-curator for that project, and we called it Fields. And we brought everybody to Cambodia, and we tried to level guest and host into knowing nothing together. So even the hosts, us, we'll have a part 2 probably in New Zealand next year. But I decided to do everything that we didn't know together. So meet with people outside of our field that we knew nothing about. Prehistory, archaeology, water, things not directly related to art. And in fact, we were, the rule was that you cannot produce anything on this residency. You cannot give anything back. And that 1 year later we would make a book, and that's what we're doing right now. We're almost finished editing it, and that just being like a place for thinking and reflecting, and it's such a huge impact because we had to be together, like face to face, without needing to use our cards, like this is who I am, this is what I make, this is what I do, this is my work. I wouldn't let anybody show each other their work. Nobody really knew what each other made unless they had a private meeting at night, excuse me. And only the very insistent, proud people wanted to show this, so they arranged a small meeting. But from this, then we realized it really shook a lot of our, a lot of what we did. It was hard to go back to actually how we produce, because we, maybe dismantled that idea of production, because cultural exchange somehow we expect is also production.
I'm really interested in this idea of kind of the scale of cultural exchange, because you're talking about a really micro level that does, that you're kind of even not letting go beyond that scale. And then when you think about cultural exchange on the level of the family of man, and trying to think about the impact that something like that might have on a community in Cambodia or in Madrid or in Israel or anywhere else. And that was in the 50s and 60s. I mean, today we have the internet. That's like the family of man times infinity. So, how do people like us navigate these things? And and another question is, what would the failure to navigate these things look like? Like, what would the failure of your work look like, do you think, in these with these issues?
Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that there is something in your questions and in all this topic about internationally coming back and forth and so on, which is very related with the market, actually. Because how do you measure the successful of production or of education or, I don't know. I mean, what I think is essential is to educate and to give the people the chances to learn, to read, to be developed as human beings in all the capacities. But that's sometimes anxiety that I feel, for example, in very young artists from Spain, of being in an exhibition in Amsterdam, in Holland, in Germany, in you know, it's like I had exhibitions in here and this and there and there and there, all over the world, no? It's something more related with the market than a real need or a real thing, no? So there are marvelous artists that have been discovered many, many years after they died, or just by chance, or who cares, no? But I think it could be healthy, obviously, always to be acquainted and be aware, and as I think it's healthy to read the newspapers. But I think it's time to, you know, to low or to stop a little bit with all that pressure, which is maybe not real. That's my point of view.
I think in a way what's given my program's traction is the sort of changing economic realities. You know, in the 90s, there was a previous generation of curators brought up in quite a different world, and it wasn't so hard for them to think of a country like Brazil as a rather exotic place where someone might go for a beach vacation, but not really a place where you would look for you know, important visual artists. And I think as countries like Brazil and China, you know, now Mexico, became very important economic players in the world scene, there was just a general sense that you couldn't ignore places like this. So what I'm trying to do was going to happen one way or the other anyway. I'm hoping I've made the process somewhat faster and you know, better directed. But I think it was something that was going to, you know, to occur in any event. I mean, just to take one example, I remember John Elderfield, who used to be our chief curator of painting and sculpture. The first time he got to Japan was not for any kind of exhibition project. It was because one of the architects who eventually got the commission for our expanded building was Japanese, Yoshio Taniguchi. So there was a tour of Taniguchi's museums in Japan. But John said before that what would happen, he would work on an exhibition project, I mean usually something like you know, Matisse. There were important pictures in Japan. You would think he would have gone to Japan to see them and thereby have been exposed to Japanese culture. But what would happen was early in the project, someone would say, you know, this budget is way out of hand. The exhibition can't cost that much. Why don't we cut out the idea of loans from Japan? And so, you know, for decades he never got to go. And that's something that no longer happens. Forget about Japan, which has sort of peaked and isn't in the same position it used to be, but people have a real interest in going to at least some of these countries that we're helping them get to.
Kind of funny, I try to not always bring up money, but I always do. And it's interesting because if you really look at the growth of multiculturalism, at least in terms of domestic policy, it follows capitalism, right? It follows like the economy, and it follows like the needs of expanded international business. And I always think it's almost a mark of the peripherality of a place when they get the more outside international value. People get excited about someone coming from abroad. Someone's like, you know, if I think it's definitely true for Israel. If an artist showed abroad, studied abroad, is abroad, smells like abroad,
but has this cachet of being from somewhere else. I know this from my upbringing in Canada. If anyone left Canada and succeeded in Canada, then they would be reclaimed as Canadians. But you could work your whole life really hard in Canada and not be recognized as a successful artist unless you show abroad. It's like a mark of success, and it follows the market. I mean, it's like you were saying, oh, suddenly I was in a developed country because we had foreign workers. And I wonder, I'm just trying to think about it more in terms of the local context here, ultimately, which is trying to think about these international exchanges and how they impact a local place, especially in Israel, which really, for all intents and purposes, is an island and doesn't have the kind of, but still has the kind of cultural exchange, but very specific, trying to be the West, trying to be like the States and Western Europe and stuff like that. Any questions? Yes.
It might be a really big question or a small question. You can regard it as you want. But what do you think is the relation between post-multiculturalism and post-colonialism?
So the question is the relationship between post-multiculturalism and post-colonialism. Erin.
Yeah, this is what it raised. I mean, I love the idea of that there's a post-multiculturalism. I mean, it's for an idea, but I think that question came up because I thought, okay, there was not for example, the case of Cambodia is that there's not the resolve of a post-colonial, enough time for the post-colonial attitude and transition and historiography, before the interruption of, a very, very intensive next political period, which erased not only the colony or, so it was a real destructive period. Without being able to articulate your new self as a post-colony, then you can't reach the post-multicultural, right? Because there's so much re-identification. And only, I feel, if you can re-identify and then identify, then you move into the other, not being the other, to try to move into the we. So there's still this very who are we and we, in many places. And until you can kind of deal with that and rewrite yourself, and that I think you can't move to. Yeah.
I think it's a very difficult question, and it's like for Scholastica or something. We need to go, all of us, into a monastery and spend hundreds of years there discussing about it. I don't know. I think that the world changed a lot, and post-colonialism also changed, because it was not the same to refer to myself what happened after the Spanish Empire, in Latin American or the Roman Empire, or to be in the very, very past to the Belgium colonies in Africa, or even the Sahara in Spain, which was a total disaster, to these Asia, whatever cases, because internet changed a lot the views and the things. But the question that is unresolved, and which is, from my point of view, the real thing and important thing, is all these differences in the economical situations of the countries. So even farther than the question about how you feel with yourself or your identity is, if you don't have money enough to survive with dignity, that's the point. And I guess it's related, but it's not exactly the same. I don't know.
So these are really big questions that we're not going to get to the bottom of tonight, but thank you so much for coming, and thank you to our speakers. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.